Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip Macmillan. Today I want to ask a question, a curious question. We seem to be going into another summer surge of COVID 19. This is 4 years after the first initial presentation of the virus, 3 years after the vaccine rollout, and multiple waves beyond that. What's going on? Why is there such a lack of interest not just in COVID, but the science around it? How do you explain this, that we're having such surges continually occurring, especially, in my view, in highly vaccinated regions? Now, one of the problems we have is that there's been such lack of interest from our public health experts and our global leaders that they can't even tell us for certain whether or not this is a global phenomenon or this is something that is just occurring in highly vaccinated regions. So here is where you come in. I want everybody who listens and who is searching for answers, reach out to your contacts, feel out what's happening in Honduras, in South America, in Africa, in all the parts of Africa, in Papua New Guinea. Are they actually having a problem with COVID 19, or is this just an issue for highly vaccinated regions? Where did I get this idea from that there is actually a surge occurring? Well, this is some information that I looked at yesterday from Eric Topol. He is a physician and scientist, and he has been one of those people who has always been in touch with what's going on early with regards to the pandemic. And so he put out this post on the 3rd of August here. And in effect, what he was highlighting was that they're estimating about 900,000 infections per day in the US based on the US wastewater data. This is where they're measuring the presence of the virus in sewage. Now look at what he is showing here. This is giving an estimation of what has happened. So this here is 2020, the peak in 2020, then later on in 2020, and then this was the Delta wave in 2021, and then you had a few other peaks beyond that. And this peak occurred in January 2024, and now we are in another peak where this is still rising, and it's at about 900,000, they estimate. And it could then go beyond even this peak that was in January 2024. What is going on? I thought that this should be over. This is clearly me being a little bit sarcastic now because I knew this wouldn't be over because I understand the science. And the science tells you we've got a problem. Now, why would I say that? We'll come back to that image in a little bit, but I'll show you first where I got into trouble just by looking at the science. This was taken from my Substack, and you can see here that what I did, this was in 2022. So you can see at the bottom here, this is April 2022. This here is the WHO coronavirus dashboard. And what I did is I took an image of it. So I clipped this image. And it was showing at the time new cases in 24 hours was about 1.3 million. And it shows you over here the total cases. So where it's dark blue was greater than 5 million cases in total. And what you were seeing was that I highlighted in terms of the this what looks like lightning, where we were seeing the most cases occurring. So you have to remember this was in April 2022, but I circled this region here, which is Africa, the lowest vaccinated region in the world. And so my question was, with the Omicron surge going on, why was this region not as significantly affected as these other Europe, US, Americas, down here, Australia, even Russia? Why was this region not as significantly affected? What was different about Africa? Because we knew at the time that they were one of the lowest vaccinated regions. Was that the reason, or were they using other medications that could have impacted on this? Well, who is to tell? Because clearly science doesn't want to know. Africa seems to be doing pretty okay, and that should in itself be a question. How do you explain that? But even if Africa was doing okay, the question would be, when you have regions in the first world that are have been vaccinated, boosted and boosted and boosted, why would they still be circulating COVID? That's a different scientific question, and one that I've applied my mind to in terms of, well, what could be the reasons? And I've come up with what I think are two reasons, right? Two of the reasons that I think are quite important. And one of them is to do with the unusual pattern that's occurring around mRNA vaccines, and that's with IgG4. And I've done this before, but I think it's important to highlight it. When we look at the types of immunoglobulins that you produce, antibodies, there are multiple different types of them. But the IgG is the main one that produces long lasting immunity. And of the long lasting immunity, it's usually IgG1 and IgG3. IgG4 is actually an antibody I didn't even know existed, really. I hadn't been studying it, but I came across it in and around the pandemic, and the fact that IgG4 levels rise significantly after mRNA vaccines. This is a tolerant antibody, meaning that it tells your immune system not to respond, different from IgG3 and IgG1. Now, that's very, very important, especially if you're seeing a situation where there is ongoing circulation of a virus. Could it be that the immune system in people with highly vaccinated regions is telling them not to respond? Don't respond to the spike protein because it's okay. Kind of like what happens to beekeepers when they're stung all the time by bees. This is in terms of the numbers that you actually see. And you can see when you have this breakdown, this is from a paper looking at a class switch towards spike specific IgG4 antibodies. This was from 2023. If you had infection and then were vaccinated, only 9% of the antibodies are IgG3. But if you had the mRNA first and then got infected, 41% are immune tolerant antibodies. If you had mRNA and no infection, it's 45.7%. Compare that to convalescents, where they are not vaccinated, it's only 1%. So this is normal. This is not normal. And so I think that this is part of the reason why we are seeing potentially circulation in highly vaccinated regions. It's an important point. But again, as I said, I can't tell you that absolutely certainly because public health hasn't been investigating it. You should think this is like the one of the most important scientific questions. Why would that be? You should have people all over this, looking and studying, trying to understand the patterns. I shouldn't have to be asking the question over and over again. There's an important part of the puzzle with regards to immune defense. And you have to remember an injectable vaccine stimulates your systemic immune system, not as effectively your mucosal immune system. And I've gone over this time and time again, but it's so important. In your upper airway, this is what happens not just with COVID, with every virus, even bacteria in this region. You have a very sophisticated mucosal immune system. It fights bacteria, it fights viruses, it fights fungi, anything that comes in here. There is a barrier. It's kind of like the skin of the airway. Same way, if you didn't have a skin, you would have infections getting into your bloodstream all the time. Your skin is an important part of your immune system in terms of your surface protection. In the same way, you can consider this region, mucosal immune system, as the skin inside the airway, preventing anything from getting through. So I have here a wall of antibodies, usually IgA, and it's only if the virus can penetrate that it gets into the lymph nodes and the bloodstream and stimulates a systemic response. What it seems to be happening is that in terms of this mucosal immune system, it's not as effective in highly vaccinated regions. We need to understand exactly why that's the case. What is the mechanism behind it? I think part of it is that essentially, when you look carefully at the mucosal immune system, even though this is a layer, so these are the cells that are in the layer. So you have all these ciliated cells, you have mucus as a physical protection. This is the airway where the virus would try and get through. So the mucus blocks it. Inside the mucus is IgA, which prevents the virus from binding to the cells to get inside the cells. But even if you had the virus managing to replicate inside a cell and try and get through, there is not only the submucosal layer here, but inside here is this tremendous immune defense, all kinds of immune cells that have been primed to deal with all kinds of viruses. So, this system, if it is effective, these are the people who will tell you they've never had COVID. Because even though they've been exposed to it multiple times, it can't penetrate their sophisticated mucosal defense. And truthfully, that mucosal defense is usually best with natural immunity. Because actually, I didn't show you this here, but when you look at the immune system, it's not even targeting the spike protein mainly. It targets a number of other proteins that the virus makes so that the T cells or the natural killer cells will identify cells that are making virus and destroy them. So it doesn't depend as much on antibodies. It's very sophisticated T cell response. So that's important to note. Now, when we therefore think about why is this mucosal defense so weak, one of the things that we have to take into consideration is the link to how the immune system is honed and focused. I'm going to show you here now quickly. This is a paper, again, I've done before, but it's so important. This was looking at BA2.86. This is the grandfather, you can say, of all these variants we're seeing now, JN1, KP1, KP2, KP3. And they were looking at neutralization escape from this Omicron variant, looking at antibodies. And this was done in 2023. So, very important information. And what it showed here, and I'll try and show you this here, is that they split the groups into a group that had the booster and a group that didn't have the booster. Now, let's look at the group that didn't have the booster first. I'll try and get this bigger so that you can see this. When you looked at their baseline, when they tested it, the antibodies to the WA1 represents the original variant. This is what they were vaccinated against first. Now, because of the way how they have done the titers on this, it looks as though this is all close together. It isn't. This is 6,000. This is 138. So this is like 30 times higher, the antibody response to the original variant. And you have to remember that this is just the baseline. So most of the antibodies here are against the original Wuhan variant, not against the latest variant here. So this is very significant. And then when they look at the boosting, and again, same principle, after they boosted them, they go up to 16,000 in terms of the response to the original variant. Compare 16,000 to 11287, 1594. So you can see that it is almost 10 times greater, the response to the original variant. And when you look at the response after the booster that was targeting this, that was only 304. So you're talking about almost 50 times lower than the response to the original variant. What it means is that this is what Gert had described as immune refocusing. The immune system is now so focused on this original variant because it had been given these vaccines so many times that it can't get out of it. It's kind of like what happens, in my view. I've said this before, it's not exactly the same thing, but I've used this as an example. It's kind of like what happens with dengue. So with dengue hemorrhagic fever, if you've been infected with the with one strain of the virus, you have immunity to it. But then what happens is if you get another strain of the virus and your immune system is unable to adjust and shift to that, you then end up in almost a cytokine storm. That's what they call dengue hemorrhagic fever, because the immune system goes into overdrive. It's responding to the first virus and can't neutralize the second virus. That's where we come into a very important principle. And this is what I've been talking about for some time, is that I am looking for this spike triggered autoimmune response mechanism, STORM. Coming up is I've done the presentation already with regards to the situation as to what I think it's about, but I'm going to talk about soon what I think can be done about it. So if you're interested in that, please look in the description to see that and join me in another few days. But it raises this critical question. We seem to be having surge after surge after surge in highly vaccinated regions. Now, again, remember, please corroborate that. Ask your friends and your family who are all over the world to tell you the answers. What they look for, because most people are not testing at home, the question is are people being admitted into hospital with COVID, even if they're not sick? That's the thing. In hospitals, they don't always get very sick. And so you have to then, that's where people usually know. And so the question would be in all of these other countries that weren't and didn't have access to all these vaccines, are they having the same kind of surge? My expectation from a scientific point of view is no, because I think that their mucosal immune system would be sophisticated enough to be able to handle that situation. And so, in closing, I want to remind you of one more thing. The reason this is so important, and this is especially in highly vaccinated regions, because the only thing they're being offered is further vaccines. And as I showed you before, even when you boost them, the main antibody response is still going to be the original variant, not necessarily the new variant, because their immune system is so refocused. So, therefore, this is why I have been talking so much about nitric oxide. Please, this is free. It's an ebook. All we want you to do is sign up to our newsletter and look at this. This is just teaching us about the principles of how nitric oxide in the sinuses, where this virus likes to sit, can help to eliminate it. And so, in this ebook, we've just covered, we made it quite short, only 30 pages, talking about the sinuses and nitric oxide, talking about nitric oxide itself, humming. This is why we wrote the book Humming Heroes, because just by humming, you will boost the nitric oxide production in your sinuses. It is such a simple strategy to reduce the risk of infection. Please just get the free ebook, share it with family and friends. This is valuable scientific information, and it takes nothing for people to do regularly. Every time you remember it, just start humming. You will boost the nitric oxide in your sinuses, and this will help. And by the way, just to mention, some people keep talking about, well, you want more nitric oxide from L-arginine. The sinuses are a reservoir, meaning that when your body needs it, it will take it. Excess elevation of any product in the body will cause problems. And so, if you take too much nitric oxide, that in itself can cause problems. Just let your sinuses have it as a reservoir. Interestingly, I think I realized when I looked at the research, this is probably why cats purr. That's what they're doing. They're humming, they're building up their nitric oxide. Fascinating stuff that we can learn from science. But the main point is we have a situation across the world where we are struggling to find answers for wave upon wave of COVID 19. And just to remind you again, the link is in the description to go to Eric Topol's site. This is what it looks like. This wave here is now starting, hasn't reached its peak yet. This is in the US based on the wastewater sample. Highly likely it will surpass all of these peaks. How long before the viral variant that Gert predicted comes along? I mean, looking at this trajectory, it's only a matter of time. Pretty serious stuff that we have ahead of us. What do we do? How do we handle it? How can we find ways around it? And finally, just to show you again from Eric Topol, we have here that in terms of the surges, look at this here. This was a surge, technically here in January of 2024. This was another surge here. This one, they are literally coming every 6 months. This is unsustainable. And it's something that we need to find answers for quickly. Remember, your job is now simple. I want you, and you put the answer in the comments. Reach out to family, friends who are anywhere in the world that are not highly vaccinated. See whether or not they are having any issues with COVID at this time. This is what we call crowd research. Since the public health isn't doing this work, I expect that we can do it ourselves. Let's get the answers, let's put it in front of them, and then clarify for certain that this is a problem of highly vaccinated regions. If that's the case, we need to understand why, because everyone is therefore at risk. Have a great evening.